Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It began with the sound of a timer. I didn't set it. I glanced at my phone, confused. The timer was ticking down, counting, relentlessly counting, towards something. 5 minutes, 23 seconds. The numbers blinked in stark contrast against the dark background of my lock screen. There was no notification, no app when it opened. Just the timer. Why was it there? I swiped my screen, hoping to close the app, but there was nothing. Just the ticking. At first, I convinced myself it was a glitch. A malfunction. I tried to ignore it, but as the minutes wore on, the sensation of unease crept in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My pulse quickened, and a weight settled on my chest, as though the air itself was becoming harder to breathe. I had been alone in my apartment for hours. The quiet was suffocating, almost unnatural. I glanced around the room, half expecting something to move in the corner of my vision, but there was nothing. Just shadows stretching from the dim light of the street lamp outside. My apartment, familiar and safe, suddenly seemed too still. The timer ticked down. I could hear it, louder now, as though it was coming from inside my head. 3 minutes, 50 seconds. It was as if it knew something I didn't. The silence was broken only by the occasional hum of a distant car passing by. But even those sounds felt muted, as though they were being absorbed by the strange tension in the air. I shook my head. Maybe it was my imagination, a side effect of being stuck in this apartment for too long. But the timer kept ticking. I tried to call someone, anyone, to break the isolation, but the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? How could I explain something that didn't make sense? The timer was approaching 1 minute. My thoughts started racing. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? This was just a glitch, a malfunction. Nothing more. But there was a cold, creeping sense of dread pooling in my stomach, like I was waiting for something inevitable. Something I couldn't escape. And then it happened. The door. A soft, almost imperceptible knock. I froze. The timer had 1 minute remaining. Who could it be at this hour? I hadn't heard anyone outside. The building was silent. The hallway outside my door was never this quiet. My heart beat faster. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just someone from the building, maybe a neighbor, but something in the back of my mind told me it was more. I moved toward the door, my feet heavy, as though the floor beneath me was sinking with every step. I stood there for a moment, pressing my ear to the door, waiting. Nothing. Then, another knock, louder this time. I didn't move. A chill ran through me. What was going on? The timer, 15 seconds. The knock came again, this time followed by something else. A scraping sound. Not on the door, but somewhere just beyond it. Something moving. I pulled away, my breath shallow, and my eyes darted around the apartment as if expecting the shadows themselves to spring to life. 10 seconds. I couldn't explain it, but the sound, the presence, it felt real. And it was closing in. 5 seconds. The sound was louder now, unmistakable, a slow, deliberate movement, like someone dragging their hand across the wood of the doorframe. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. 3 seconds. I couldn't stop myself. The fear gripped me. 1 second. The timer hit 0. And then, the door burst open. The door swung open with a violent creak, sending a jolt of panic through my chest. My heart hammered against my ribs as I instinctively took a step back. There was no one there. I stared into the dim hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air was heavy, thick with an unsettling stillness. No one. Nothing. But the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat began to bead on my skin. I could feel something, someone, watching me. It was as though the very space around me had become alive, pressing in, suffocating me. I stepped into the hallway, slowly, cautiously, my gaze scanning every corner. The overhead light flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The familiar hallway, with its worn carpet and neutral beige walls, felt foreign now, as though it had been twisted into something ominous. I glanced back at my open door, the one I had just closed behind me, but it was like an invisible force was pulling me further into the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out of place. I was certain I had heard that scraping sound right before the knock, and yet the hallway was still and silent now. The timer, I realized, was still ticking. I fumbled for my phone, pulling it out of my pocket. The screen was still lit, the countdown now reduced to 0 minutes. But there was no notification. No explanation. The app wasn't even open. It was as though the timer had appeared from nowhere and vanished into thin air, leaving no trace. Then, from somewhere deep inside me, a thought formed. Was it a warning? I shook my head. No. That was insane. There was no logical reason for any of this. And yet, another sound. A faint shuffle, like feet moving slowly across the floor just behind me. My pulse skyrocketed. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway remained empty. The sound stopped. But then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved. A shadow. It wasn't cast by any of the overhead lights. It was darker, more solid, stretching unnaturally along the walls. I blinked, trying to focus, but it shifted too quickly, like a ripple across the surface of a dark pool. A cold gust of air rushed past me, carrying the faint smell of something metallic, something almost rotten. The scent made my stomach churn, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow. I backed up toward my apartment door, feeling the cold sweat on my skin. But before I could reach the handle, something stopped me, a sound, closer now. A whisper. It was a voice, but it wasn't one I recognized. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it wasn't my imagination. I heard it again, the words forming out of the stillness, as though someone was speaking from just beyond my reach. It's too late. The words echoed in my mind, repeating in a voice that was neither human nor natural. My breath hitched to my throat, and I froze, paralyzed with terror. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to leave the building, to do anything but stand there, but I couldn't move. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the temperature in the hallway drop several degrees, the air thick with dread. I whipped my head around, searching for the source, but the hallway was empty. Yet, the presence lingered. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around me, pressing in on my chest, suffocating me. The timer on my phone went off again. I jumped, startled by the sudden beep, but when I looked at the screen, the numbers were gone. The phone was blank. And then, before I could process what was happening, the door to my apartment slammed shut behind me with an ear-splitting bang, trapping me in the hallway. I spun toward it, trying the handle frantically. It wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, calling out, but no sound came from the other side. The air around me felt thick, too heavy to breathe. And then, I heard it, louder than before, unmistakable. A knock. On the door. But this time, it wasn't coming from the apartment behind me. It was coming from inside the hallway, from somewhere, I couldn't tell where, just there, in the space that surrounded me. I turned toward the source of the sound, my stomach churning, but the hallway stretched on forever. There was no end. No escape. And then, in the distance, I saw something, a figure, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall, its shape indistinct, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. It began to move toward me. The figure moved. Slowly. Methodically. Its shape was distorted, stretching and shrinking like it was fighting against the very walls of the hallway. I couldn't make out any distinct features, just a silhouette, dark and undefined, standing there in the distance. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to hover just above the ground as it inched closer. I felt my throat tighten, a lump forming as I tried to swallow. My mind raced, frantically looking for answers, but nothing came. The timer on my phone, the knock, the shadow, everything was connected. I didn't understand how or why, but I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me like a storm cloud ready to burst. I tried the door again, throwing my shoulder against it, but it didn't budge. I had no escape. The figure was getting closer now, its movements jerky, like it was unsure of its own existence. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. My breath came out in short bursts, visible in the suddenly freezing air. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The figure was close enough now that I could see faint details, its limbs long and unnatural, twisting in ways that should have been impossible. There was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. The closer it got, the more I could feel the dread in my bones. It was like looking at a half-formed nightmare. Then, it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even male or female, it was a low, guttural rasp, vibrating through the walls of the hallway. The words came out in fragments, as if they were being dragged from some dark place I didn't want to understand. You shouldn't have opened the door. The words slithered through the air, twisting around me like a physical force, pressing against my chest. I staggered back, unable to breathe, the weight of the voice sinking deep into my gut. I couldn't look away. The figure continued to move toward me, its steps deliberate, but there was no sound of feet hitting the floor, only the faint hum of the air being displaced as it advanced. I could feel the cold creeping closer, like fingers of ice crawling over my skin. What was it? The thought tore through my mind, desperate and urgent. But there were no answers. Just a gnawing emptiness, as if the very idea of understanding was slipping through my fingers. The timer, now gone from my phone, seemed to hang in the air itself, marking the seconds in a way I couldn't escape. The figure stopped about 5 feet away from me, its form still flickering between shadows and light, stretching unnaturally. It was as if the hallway itself couldn't hold its shape. The darkness around it bent, swirling. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped by the sight of it. My mind was telling me to fight back, to do anything, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had rooted itself deep within me, and I was paralyzed by it. It raised one arm slowly, its fingers elongated, pale, like they were made of something that wasn't flesh. The hand reached toward me, trembling as it drew closer. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as its fingers brushed the air in front of my face, I heard something, a voice, louder now, but still distant. My own voice. Get out. It was a command, desperate, almost pleading. I didn't know where it had come from, but the fear surged, filling my body with adrenaline. Without thinking, I bolted. I slammed my shoulder against the door again, this time with all the strength I had left, and, with a screech, it finally gave way. I stumbled backward into my apartment, the door slamming shut behind me, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I heard it. The knock. Louder this time. More insistent. It came from inside the apartment, not from the hallway. The sound was clear, sharp, as though it was right next to me. I turned, my heart racing again, but there was no one there. Just the silence. And the door. The same door I had just closed. I didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds? Minutes? The sense of time had fractured, and now I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The knock came again, more frantic now. The air in the room seemed to tighten, as though the walls were closing in on me. I had to leave. I had to get out. But when I reached for the door handle, it wouldn't turn. My hand gripped it, twisted, but it was locked. It had been locked. I never locked it. I pulled at the handle again and again, but it wouldn't give. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. It wasn't just the door anymore. The whole room seemed to tremble with it, as though the house itself was alive and trying to expel me. I turned, stumbling into the kitchen, looking for something, anything, that could help. The countertop was cluttered with empty cups, unopened mail, a knife. I reached for it instinctively, my fingers cold, the blade sharp in my hand. I had no plan, no direction. But I had to do something. Another knock, this time followed by a scraping sound. It was moving. The shadow, the figure, it was here. The scraping sound grew louder. It wasn't just the walls now. It was the floor beneath my feet, the ceiling above my head, the very air I breathed. The entire apartment was alive with it. Each scrape, each gnawing noise, felt like a claw dragging through my mind. The walls pulsed with it, as though the apartment itself was trying to expel me, to push me away from the figure closing in. I clutched the knife in my hand tighter, feeling its cold steel dig into my palm. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. The idea of defending myself seemed absurd, impossible. How could a knife stop whatever was coming? The knocking persisted. Relentless. Terrifying. I stumbled backward into the kitchen, my eyes darting around the room, trying to find some escape, some way out. But the room was shrinking, the air growing thicker with every breath. My mind felt clouded, the edges of reality blurring, leaving only the overwhelming sense of something wrong. I had to think. I had to do something. But my thoughts were scattered. Fear gripped me in ways I couldn't explain. The scraping noise shifted. It was louder now, right behind me. I spun around, knife raised, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. The figure, it was standing in the kitchen doorway. It was closer than I had ever imagined. Its shape was a blur, shifting with every blink of my eyes, but I could make out the details now. The limbs were long, unnaturally so, And the fingers, if they could even be called fingers, were impossibly thin, each one elongated and twitching. Its body was nearly transparent, but I could see the way it distorted the air around it, like heat rising off pavement in the summer. A cold shiver ran through me. I could feel the temperature drop in the room, as though the thing had the power to suck all warmth from the air. My breath fogged in front of me, my skin tingling as the chill seeped into my bones. It didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, its head tilting slightly to the side, as if it were studying me, watching me with a curiosity that sent a bolt of pure terror through my chest. "You should have listened." The voice came again, low and gurgling, like it was coming from somewhere deep, far beyond the figure itself. It made my skin crawl, and my legs felt weak. I wanted to run, to get away, but my body refused to obey. "You can't escape." The words wrapped themselves around me, suffocating me, drowning out the rational part of my mind that still tried to understand what was happening. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black, deep pools of darkness, unblinking, sucking in the light around them. I tried to look away, but they held me, pinning me in place. Suddenly, it took a step forward. I didn't think. I couldn't think. I just acted. I swung the knife in a wide arc, my hand trembling as I aimed for the figure. The blade cut through the air, but it didn't connect. The figure didn't even flinch. It moved. The shape wavered, distorting like smoke, and the knife passed through it as if it were made of mist. I stumbled backward, the fear in my chest a tangible weight. My mind was screaming, this wasn't real, it couldn't be real. But there it was, standing in front of me, the air thick with its presence. Another step. Closer. The scraping noise intensified, as if the walls themselves were being torn apart. It was coming from all around me now, the house crumbling on itself. The floor beneath me groaned as though it couldn't support the weight of the thing in front of me. And then, something snapped. A loud crack. The apartment trembled as if it was shaking off its own skin. The walls seemed to ripple, stretching like the skin of an animal. I glanced around, heart pounding in my chest, and saw the cracks. The room was splitting apart. The ceiling, the walls, they were all breaking down, unraveling, like reality itself was coming undone. I didn't have time to process what was happening. The figure was moving again. This time, it was faster, its long limbs extending toward me. Its hand, like a claw, reached out, and I could feel the pull of it, like it was dragging my very soul toward it. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from it. The apartment door was still locked, but the hallway beyond it felt like a distant, unreachable place. I couldn't stay here. I had to escape. I ran through the apartment, my footsteps loud, echoing through the emptiness. The floors groaned under my weight. The light above flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. I didn't dare look behind me. I couldn't. The scraping sound followed me, relentless and never-ending. I reached the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I pulled at the blinds, my hands trembling. But when I looked outside, I saw nothing. Just the same empty street I had walked down hours ago. It was like the world beyond the window had disappeared. Then I heard it again. The knock. Louder, closer this time, coming from the window. I spun around, my heart stopping in my chest. It was standing behind me. The figure. It was right there. Its fingers brushed my shoulder. And everything went dark. darkness. I could barely breathe. It felt like the air was pressing down on me, smothering me, making it impossible to move, impossible to think. The chill from the figure's touch still lingered on my skin, a cold that sank deeper than just my body. It was like it had touched something in me, something I couldn't quite name, but it felt like it had infected my very soul. I don't know how long I was in that darkness, seconds, minutes, hours, it didn't matter. Time felt like a distant memory, something I couldn't grasp. I couldn't remember if I was standing or lying down, if I was even breathing. It was as though the world had folded in on itself, leaving me alone in a void. Then, a sound. A whisper. "You shouldn't have run." The voice was colder than ice, echoing in the emptiness around me. It wasn't just the voice from before, that low rasp. No. This voice was different. It was softer, more insistent, like it was speaking right into my mind. I tried to open my eyes, but they wouldn't move. I couldn't feel my limbs. My body was heavy, weighed down by the same suffocating pressure that surrounded me. And then, light. It was faint at first, just a flicker, like a distant candle in a vast, empty room. But it grew. It grew brighter, stronger, until it filled the space around me, burning through the darkness. My eyes stung, but I couldn't look away. I felt the cold retreat, but it left something in its place. Something darker. Something heavier. "You can't hide." The words came from everywhere, filling the space. They vibrated in my skull, rattled through my bones. I wasn't sure if I was hearing them with my ears or if they were coming from inside my mind, but I felt them like a physical blow. The light around me flickered again, and for a moment, I saw it. The figure. It stood in front of me, no longer distorted, no longer a blur. It was solid, fully formed, but still so wrong. Its body twisted in ways that made me want to look away, but I couldn't. The long limbs were too thin, like sticks breaking under pressure, and the fingers, those long, gnarled fingers, curled into claws, inching toward me with an awful, deliberate slowness. It was wearing the darkness like a cloak, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, pulsing with an unnatural glow, empty, hollow, but watching me with a hunger I could feel crawling under my skin. "You can't escape," it whispered again, the words drawn out, coated in something like venom. I wanted to scream, to shout, to fight back. But there was nothing. My mouth wouldn't move. My chest wouldn't rise with a breath. I was trapped in my own body, frozen under the weight of its presence. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me. I could feel the air shift, the very space between us warping as if the distance itself was being bent. I could smell it now, the stench of rot, like something decaying in the earth. It filled my lungs, thick and suffocating. I had to do something. I had to wake up. The light flickered again, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. I was in the apartment again, my apartment, or what was left of it. The walls were cracked, the ceiling sagging, as if the house itself was dying. The air was still cold, but the darkness had deepened, swallowed everything I knew. The knocking came again, but this time it wasn't just from the door. It was everywhere, every wall, every corner, the floor beneath my feet. It reverberated through my skull, louder and louder, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside me. I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead, but I managed to stand. I gripped the knife, still in my hand, though I hadn't remembered picking it up, and stumbled toward the door. "Please, just open." I didn't know why I thought it would help. The door was locked. It had always been locked. I pulled the handle again, harder this time, desperate. And then it opened. The door creaked and groaned, revealing the hallway beyond. But it wasn't the hallway I remembered. The walls were shifting, melting, as if they were made of some liquid substance. The floor was uneven, rippling under my feet. I could see the outline of the figure again, standing at the far end, waiting. It was silent now, its eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I knew what it was going to do. I could feel it. It was going to drag me back into the dark. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched in front of me, impossibly long. I took a step forward, but with each step I took, the distance between us grew. The walls closed in, pushing me toward the figure. And then I heard it again. The knock. It was coming from inside the hallway. It was getting closer. I could feel the heat of the figure's gaze on the back of my neck. It was right behind me. I didn't know how much time had passed, how long I had been running, how long I had been trapped in this nightmare. The room was fading now, the edges blurring again. My body felt like it was dissolving, slipping away from me. And then, everything went still. The knocking stopped. The figure was gone. But the cold remained. The same cold. And the silence. I stood there, motionless, unsure of where I was or what had just happened. Had I escaped? Or had I fallen deeper into whatever this place was? My hand, still gripping the knife, trembled. I heard it again, the voice. But this time, it wasn't inside my head. It was coming from the window. You can't hide. The figure was outside, waiting. It's late. Too late. My fingers ache from typing, but I can't stop. The report is due tomorrow, and the deadline is looming like a dark cloud. The glow of the screen casts an eerie light over the room, leaving shadows in every corner. I glance at the clock, 2:45 a.m. The house is silent. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, fills every empty space until it feels suffocating. My eyes flicker back to the screen, but something outside catches my attention. A movement. I freeze. I wasn't expecting anyone at this hour, especially not outside my window. I force myself to look again. The night is still, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, I see it. A figure. Standing on the sidewalk. Motionless. For a moment, I think it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it's a shadow or someone walking by, but no. The figure is too still, too deliberate. It's facing the house, standing directly in front of the window, watching. My heart skips. I'm not sure if it's the late hour or the sudden surge of unease, but my chest tightens. I swallow hard, trying to steady my breath. I glance around the room, as if expecting someone else to be there with me. There's no one. Just the clicking of my keyboard and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I slowly turn my attention back to the figure outside. It hasn't moved. It's still staring in my direction. I hesitate, wondering if I should call the police. But what would I say? There's someone standing outside my window, and they're just standing there. I shake my head. It sounds ridiculous. I'm being paranoid. Still, my gaze lingers on the figure. Something about it makes my skin crawl. I feel like it's waiting for something. But what? I tell myself to look away. Don't stare. Don't make it worse. I focus back on the report, the words blurring together on the screen. But I can't ignore it. The figure is still there. It hasn't moved a muscle. My fingers hover over the keyboard, and I find myself drawn back to the window again. Just a glance. But the figure isn't where it was anymore. It's closer. I don't know how, but it's standing just a few feet from the window now, its face indistinguishable in the dark, yet I can feel its eyes, its gaze, locking onto me. I stiffen. This isn't normal. Something's wrong. The sudden shift in distance, the quiet way it happened, the cold dread building in my chest, this isn't right. My mind races, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it's someone lost. Maybe it's just a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the wind. But then, I hear it. A faint creak, like a footstep on the way outside. I flinch. That wasn't in my head. Another footstep. Then silence. I take a step back from the window, my heart pounding in my ears. I reach for my phone. Should I call someone? Should I check again? But no, something stops me. If I look, will it be closer? Will it be right outside? I stand there, frozen. My eyes fixed on the corner of the window, barely daring to peek. And then, I hear it. A tap. A soft, slow tap on the glass. I don't move. I don't breathe. The tapping continues, rhythmic, deliberate. Like someone, or something, trying to get my attention. I can't bring myself to turn. I want to run, but my legs won't cooperate. I want to scream, but my throat feels like it's been sealed shut. The tapping stops. But now, I can feel it. Something is behind me. The temperature drops. I can feel the cold creeping into the room, seeping into my bones. I turn. Nothing. But I can still feel it, the presence, hovering in the air, thick and suffocating. I move to the window, but I don't want to look outside. I don't want to see what I know is there. But I do anyway. And when I do, it's gone. The figure. The tapping. Gone. I take a deep, shaky breath. What just happened? Was it a trick of the mind? Was I just too tired? I force myself to sit back down, my hands trembling as I try to focus on the screen again. The words swim in front of me. My thoughts are scattered, uncertain. Was I imagining it? I glance once more at the window. There's nothing outside. Just the empty street. Just the darkness. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I see something. A movement. The figure isn't gone after all. It's standing on the other side of the window now, staring straight at me. And this time, I know it wasn't my imagination. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. It had been a long day at work, and the ticking of the clock seemed to be mocking me, dragging every minute along with it. The office was silent, save for the soft hum of the overhead lights and the occasional shuffle of papers. I had stayed late again, like I always did. But tonight was different. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, like the world outside had gone completely quiet, holding its breath. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Just one more hour, and I'd finally be able to leave. I turned my attention back to the screen, where the numbers and lines blurred together in a haze. I was trying to focus, but something kept pulling at the edges of my mind. A faint noise, something that didn't belong. It was like a creak, a scrape, but from where? The room was empty. I stood and walked to the window, my mind on autopilot. The city outside was bathed in the dull glow of streetlights, the streets eerily deserted. I leaned closer, squinting to make out any details. There, standing on the sidewalk, was a figure. A man. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out his silhouette clearly enough. He was staring directly at me. His body was still, unmoving, but his eyes, I could feel them on me. Cold. Unblinking. I froze. There was something about him that felt wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. Was he waiting for something? Was he just another late-night passerby? I turned away, trying to shake the discomfort that was creeping over me. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. I couldn't focus on it. I forced my attention back to my work, but the image of the man lingered. The back of my neck prickled, as if he was still watching me, even though I couldn't see him anymore. I tried to push the feeling aside, but it stuck with me like a shadow. Minutes passed, maybe more, before I felt the pull to look again. I didn't want to, but something made me turn back to the window, to that same spot on the street. I gasped. He was closer. Much closer. He was no longer standing on the sidewalk. No, he had crossed the street. He was standing at the base of the building now, staring up at me, his face still hidden in darkness, but I could feel his gaze pinning me to the window. My heart started to race. How had he moved so quickly? How had he gotten so close without me hearing anything? I hadn't heard footsteps. There was no sound at all. I stepped back, my body suddenly heavy, my mind scrambling to understand what was happening. This had to be some kind of mistake. There was no way this was real. I forced myself to look away, to focus on something else. But my eyes kept darting back to the window, back to the dark figure that seemed to be getting closer with every passing second. The space between us, between the figure and myself, seemed to shrink with each blink. I thought of calling the police, but what could I say? There's a man standing outside my window, but he's not doing anything. He wasn't doing anything. But he didn't need to. I felt the weight of his stare, burning into me. My skin crawled, my pulse pounding in my ears. There was something about him, something that felt too deliberate, too purposeful. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something, to make the first move. I tried to breathe, but the air in the room felt thick, like it was choking me. Suddenly, the man moved. Slowly, like a puppet with its strings pulled by something unseen. His head tilted, just slightly. The motion was so subtle, but the change in his posture made my stomach lurch. I knew he was still staring at me, his eyes locked on mine, but the way his head turned, it felt wrong. The silence in the room grew deeper. There was no sound from outside. No passing cars. No wind rustling the trees. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet. I looked at the clock again. 3 minutes. That's how long it had been since I last checked. But when I looked back at the window, the man was no longer standing in front of it. My heart skipped a beat. Had he left? I stepped forward cautiously, my breath shallow. I peered through the glass, squinting into the dark. There was no sign of him. No movement. No shape in the shadows. He was gone. Relief washed over me, followed by confusion. What had I seen? Was I just imagining things? Had the fatigue from working too late played tricks on my mind? But just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A tap. Tap. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A knock on the glass. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was standing right outside the window, so close I could have reached out and touched him. He was smiling. Or was it just the shape of his face? The darkness, the way it seemed to shift around him, made it impossible to tell. But that grin, it was unmistakable. He was smiling at me. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone again. I didn't wait to see if he was coming back. I ran. I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest as if it was trying to escape. The apartment felt suffocatingly quiet, the only sound my ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my pulse. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the cluttered floor, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I had to get out. What the hell was that? What had I just seen? The moment I turned away from the window, I was hit with a rush of panic. The face, that eerie grin, had it been real? Was I losing my mind? Or was there something out there, something watching me, waiting for me to make a move? I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I had to get outside. I needed air. I needed to see someone, anyone, to make sure I wasn't trapped in some nightmare. I reached for the doorknob, but as my fingers brushed against the cold metal, the faintest sound stopped me. Scratching. It came from the window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My mind refused to process it. It was just the wind, I told myself. The building settling, the trees brushing against the window, anything but what I feared. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like fingernails on glass. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building. It was him. I turned and sprinted back to the window, but I didn't dare get too close. I pressed myself against the wall, my eyes darting around the room, every shadow now an enemy. The silence seemed to swallow the apartment whole. My gaze locked on the window. For a split second, there was nothing. Just the reflection of the dim light in the glass, the empty street outside, the darkened shapes of the city fading into the distance. Then, tap. It was light, almost delicate, like the whisper of someone's fingers tapping the glass. But there was no mistaking it. He was out there, just like before, and this time, he was trying to get my attention. Tap. 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 I felt my body go cold, and I instinctively backed away from the window, my legs shaking. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. My mind raced, desperately searching for a logical explanation. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe I was still just tired, too exhausted from working late and staring at the screen for hours. But no, deep down, I knew. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't fatigue. This was something else. A figure standing motionless in the dark. The sound of his fingers against the window. The way he watched. I tried to steady my breathing, closing my eyes for a brief moment. I needed to think. I needed to understand what was going on. What did he want from me? Why was he doing this? I thought of the people I called friends, colleagues I'd known for years, but I couldn't reach out to them. Who would believe me? What would I say? that I had a stalker standing outside my window, tapping on the glass as if he knew exactly when I'd be there? I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain him. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. A silence so deep and unnatural, it felt as if the whole world had held its breath. It lingered, thick and oppressive. I crept back toward the window, unable to resist the pull to look. When I glanced outside, I saw nothing. The street was empty. The sidewalk was barren. No shadow, no shape, no man. Nothing. I exhaled a shaky breath, my body relaxing just a fraction, but my instinct screamed at me to stay alert. My mind was still reeling, but there was something else, something I couldn't explain. A sinking feeling. The sense that it wasn't over. That the worst was yet to come. I pulled away from the window, stumbling back into the center of the room. My eyes darted around, scanning every corner, every shadow, searching for something, anything that might explain this nightmare. Then I saw it. A figure in the reflection, standing directly behind me. My heart stopped. I spun around. The room was empty. No one was there. But when I looked at the window again, I could see it, the faintest outline of a person. He wasn't outside anymore. He was inside the reflection, standing just behind me, closer than he had ever been. His head tilted slightly to one side, his eyes dark and unblinking, the grin now wider, too wide. I backed away, my hands trembling, trying to tear my eyes away from the reflection, but I couldn't. The window, the glass, wasn't just a window anymore. It was a portal. And he was coming through. Suddenly, the glass cracked. A sharp, splintering sound that split the silence, and I screamed. The crack in the glass spread like a spider's web, jagged lines radiating from the center. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the fractures. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear nothing else, nothing but the frantic drum of my own pulse. What was happening? Why wasn't anyone else hearing this? Why wasn't anyone coming to help? Was this all in my head? The room felt smaller now. The air had become thick, suffocating, like it had been pulled out of the room, leaving only panic. Every corner of the apartment seemed darker than before, the shadows stretching out as if they were alive. I tried to focus, tried to think, but my mind kept spiraling back to that man. The man in the window. He wasn't outside anymore. He wasn't behind me either. He was somewhere else. Watching. Waiting. I moved toward the kitchen, my steps unsteady, eyes darting across the room. The dishes from last night were still stacked on the counter, the half-drunk glass of water I'd left out earlier now forgotten. But none of that mattered. I was consumed by the feeling that something was coming, something that I couldn't stop. The window. The cracked glass. I needed to get out. I stumbled toward the door again, desperate to leave, but something tugged at my mind. A voice, whispering from somewhere deep inside me. You're not alone. The whisper was sharp, close, too close. It sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, unable to move. My breath hitched in my throat, my body paralyzed. I turned, slowly, trying to catch any movement, any shift in the shadows. Nothing. Nothing but the creaking of the building, the groan of the walls. I was losing it. This was just stress. Work. The isolation. The dark circles under my eyes. But the whisper came again, louder this time. You're not alone. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, in the reflection of the kitchen window, I saw it. His silhouette. Dark. Featureless. But his presence was unmistakable, standing just beyond the edge of the reflection, inches from where I was. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, staring at the reflection. The shape of him, twisted and unnatural, seemed to press in closer with every heartbeat. His hands, long and thin, tapped softly against the glass. Tap. 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 The sound was sickening, each tap louder than the last. My vision blurred, my mind a hurricane of terror and confusion. I had to leave. I had to run. But where could I go? What if he'd followed? What if there was nowhere safe? The tapping stopped. I held my breath, not daring to move, not daring to blink. Then, another noise. The sound of something dragging across the floor. Soft at first, barely audible. Then louder. Closer. I forced myself to look around the room, my eyes scanning every inch of the space, every shadow. The dragging sound was coming from the hallway, right outside the kitchen. The floor creaked underfoot as if something, was inching closer. I didn't know if I should run or hide, or if either would even matter. He was inside my head now, turning everything into a nightmare. He had taken control of this place, this space that had once felt safe. The dragging stopped just outside the door. And then the light flickered. A slow, unnatural dimming that pulsed like a heartbeat. The room grew colder, the air heavier. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but my fingers fumbled. The screen wouldn't light up. My mind was a blur of panic as I swiped uselessly at the screen, trying to find some signal, some connection to the outside world. But there was nothing. Nothing. I felt a presence behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. I felt his gaze, cold and heavy, like a weight pressing against my back. He was there. So close now, so close that I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise in response. A whisper right in my ear. "I see you." I screamed. I didn't care if anyone could hear me anymore. I didn't care if I sounded insane. I didn't care about anything except getting away from him. I spun around, my eyes locking onto the dark figure in the reflection. But he wasn't in the reflection anymore. He was there. Standing just a foot away, his long, thin fingers outstretched, his eyes wide and empty, his grin too wide, too jagged. The room spun, and everything went black. I woke to the sound of silence. Thick, heavy silence. My eyes fluttered open, and the first thing I noticed was the air. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. My breath came out in visible puffs, a sign that the room had somehow dropped several degrees. I sat up quickly, the shock of the sudden change jolting my body into motion. I was still in the kitchen, still on the floor. But the man, the thing, he was gone. The figure that had been so close, so tangible just moments ago, was no longer there. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? The darkness played tricks on your mind when you were alone for too long, right? But then, why did I feel the lingering presence of his gaze? Why did my skin still crawl with the memory of that smile, that impossible smile? I rubbed my eyes, trying to push the images away. But the smell lingered. That sharp, metallic scent that clung to the air. It was faint now, but it was there, a reminder of what I had just faced. I slowly got to my feet, my body stiff and sore. The apartment seemed off. The familiar things in the room, my coffee table, the worn-out sofa, even the kitchen counter, everything seemed to be pushed to the edges of my perception, like they were fading, becoming distant. The room was a shadow of itself. The lights flickered again. I froze. This time, it wasn't just the usual power surge. It felt deliberate. A warning. The bulbs above me dimmed again, their light barely able to cut through the oppressive darkness that had settled in the room. Then came a soft sound, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The dragging noise. It started faintly, from the other side of the apartment, and it grew louder. Slower this time, as if it was being dragged across something rough, something sharp. I couldn't help myself. I had to see. I moved toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if I was wading through thick, invisible fog. The walls felt closer, the air thinner, pressing in on me from all sides. I gripped the doorframe of the hallway, steadying myself as the noise became clearer. It was coming toward me. I forced myself to breathe. I could still hear my pulse, thudding in my ears, drowning out everything else. The dragging stopped just outside the living room, just out of my view. Then a sound I couldn't ignore. Did you hear that? It was just a simple question. One I would normally ask without a second thought. But tonight, in the quiet of my apartment, the words felt different. My voice, unsteady, seemed to hesitate before the question left my lips. I was talking to Alex, my childhood friend. We've shared everything over the years, but there was something in the air tonight, something that unsettled me. It wasn't the conversation. We'd been talking about a recent job I'd taken up, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as the words left my mouth, I felt it, a subtle shift, a presence just beyond the edge of my awareness. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Silence hung thick in the room. The city's usual hum was barely audible, as if everything had been muted. We had just finished talking about work when I heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, slipping between our words. At first, I thought it was just interference. You know, the kind that happens when the signal cuts out for a moment. But this was different. It wasn't the usual static. This was a voice. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Alex's. I stared at my phone, the screen still lit with our call. Alex, did you hear that? There was a long pause on the other end. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost cautious. Yeah. I thought it was just me. I heard something too. I frowned. My heart rate picked up. We hadn't said anything unusual. No one else was in the apartment, and yet the voice lingered, faint but present. It felt like it was just behind me, breathing down my neck. Could it be a prank? Alex suggested, his tone wavering slightly. No, it didn't sound like that. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the unease. It was like someone was whispering, but we couldn't catch it. The line went quiet for a moment, but then, there it was again. A whisper. Only this time, it was louder. Closer. It came through so clearly, I could almost make out the words. Turn around. I froze. My blood ran cold. Alex's voice cut through the tension. What did it say? I didn't respond. My gaze shifted to the living room, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. I hadn't moved from my spot, and the apartment hadn't changed. Everything was exactly as it had been, save for that voice. But the air, the atmosphere, it felt different now, like it was pressing in on me. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, another whisper came through, this one even clearer. "I'm right behind you." I jumped, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I turned toward the sound, toward the empty room, but there was nothing there. Only the dark corners, the quiet furniture, the cold stillness of my apartment. Alex's voice cracked through the silence again. "You okay?" "I'm hearing it too now. But no one's here, right?" I glanced at the door, the single entry point to my apartment. The locks were secure. No one had come in. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood up slowly, my phone pressed to my ear, the quiet hum of the call barely masking the unsettling whisper that still seemed to echo in my mind. "Yeah, no one's here," I muttered, my voice almost hollow. "But Alex, I'm really starting to freak out. It's like it's in the room with me." Another pause. Then, a quiet response from Alex. "Maybe it's some weird interference, or someone messing with us." But I couldn't shake it. The voice, that voice, wasn't a glitch. It was too distinct. Too real. I took a few hesitant steps toward the hallway. The whispering had stopped, but the air felt charged. The silence now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. My heart pounded as I moved through the apartment, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the otherwise quiet space. Then, just as I reached the living room, I heard it again. "Turn around." It wasn't coming through the phone this time. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat. The apartment was empty. No one was there. But the whisper didn't stop. It kept repeating the same phrase, getting louder with each repetition. "Turn around. I'm right behind you. Turn around." I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in, the shadows pressing against me, the voice seeping into every corner of my mind. "Alex," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "It's here. It's in my apartment." Alex's voice was distant, as if he was unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean? You're not alone?" I couldn't answer him. My gaze drifted to the shadows, my body frozen in place. I could feel the presence now. It was undeniable. It was real. But where was it? I didn't know. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whisper stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, everything was still. No sound. No voice. "Alex?" I finally croaked, trying to steady my breathing. "Yeah," he responded. His voice sounded normal again, but I could hear the edge of panic creeping in. "Did you hear it?" I whispered. "I didn't hear anything now. But I think I did earlier." It was like, he hesitated. "It was like there was another voice, right?" I nodded. "I'm going crazy, aren't I?" No. We both heard it. But I couldn't explain it. No one could. What I heard, what we both heard, didn't make sense. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't static. It was real. And that thought terrified me more than anything. I wasn't alone. And whatever that voice was, it was still with me. The phone call with Alex ended shortly after. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to end it, like talking more would somehow make whatever that thing was even real. But the silence that followed his words, it was suffocating. More than anything, it was unsettling, because the silence didn't feel like it belonged. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. I sat down, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. The living room felt different now, off, somehow. The shadows were darker than they should have been, and even the stillness felt alive. My mind was racing. I needed to focus, to tell myself it was just a glitch, just a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I ran my fingers through my hair, pacing in small circles around the apartment. The room felt too big and too empty. Every creak of the floorboard sounded too loud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by a person, but by something else. Something I couldn't see, but could feel. A noise broke the silence again. A soft click, like a switch being turned on. I froze. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see someone outside. But there was nothing, just the darkness of the street below. The only movement came from the leaves blowing across the sidewalk, pushed by the faint wind. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat on the back of my neck. I was getting paranoid. This had to be a side effect of the stress from work, right? But then the voice came again. This time, it was louder. Look in the corner. It wasn't the same soft whisper anymore. It was a low growl, a scraping sound that sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but blood rushing in my ears. The corner. I knew what corner it meant. The one near the window, where my bookshelf stood, where a chair sat almost like it had been forgotten. But nothing was there. Was it a trick? My mind was still trying to rationalize it, to make sense of what was happening. But there was no logical explanation for it. I had just spoken to Alex, and he had heard it too. So why was I still alone in this room? Why did it feel like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare? I slowly approached the corner. The floor creaked beneath my feet, each step feeling heavier than the last. I looked around again, my eyes flicking from the bookshelf to the shadows. Nothing moved. There was no sign of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I stood there for a moment, staring into the corner, waiting for something to happen. But there was only silence. I leaned forward, my breath shallow, my body tense. I reached out, pushing the chair aside. And there, behind it, was a small object. A broken cell phone. I didn't recognize it at first. But as I reached down to pick it up, my stomach dropped. I realized what it was. The phone had been smashed, its screen cracked and shattered. It looked like it had been dropped, or perhaps thrown. But the strange part was that it wasn't mine. I didn't own a second phone. And yet here it was, lying in the corner of my living room, broken as if it had been there for days. My hands trembled as I held it. The air seemed to grow colder around me, and a knot tightened in my chest. The phone wasn't just a random object, it felt like an omen. A sign that whatever had been whispering to me had a presence here, in this space, in this apartment. I turned the phone over in my hands, looking for any clue as to where it had come from, but there was nothing. No markings. No names. Just a random, discarded object. The whispering voice came again, but this time it was even more insistent, more demanding. Look closer. My pulse quickened, my hands shaking. I almost didn't want to, but I couldn't resist. The voice that shouldn't have been there, demanded it. I pressed my thumb to the cracked screen. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A flicker. A flash of light. But it was gone as soon as it appeared. My heart raced. What was that? I squinted at the screen, trying to make out any details. It was just static, a mess of blurry pixels. But then, through the haze, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A message. You're not alone. The words weren't written in text. They were different. As if they had been carved into the screen with a sharp object, leaving faint impressions behind. The message was clear, unmistakable, but it made no sense. How could this be? I had never seen this phone before. No one had been in my apartment except for me. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the message vanished. The screen went black again. I stood frozen, clutching the phone in my hands. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to do. My mind spun in circles, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had it been some sort of hallucination? But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone was here. Watching me. Playing with me. And whatever it wasn't done yet. I dropped the phone onto the floor and backed away slowly. I glanced around the room one last time, but I could feel it now. That cold, oppressive presence was closing in again. And then I heard it. Another whisper. This time, it was clearer, sharper. It's too late to leave now. I froze. My blood ran cold. I had to get out of there. But where could I go? Who could I trust? And more importantly, who was the voice really? The voice had changed. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was louder, clearer, more confident. It felt like it was in the room with me, right next to my ear, a sharp, hissing presence that wasn't bound by the phone or the walls of my apartment. I stepped back, almost tripping over the coffee table in my haste to get away from the phone that now lay on the floor like an artifact of some twisted game. My mind raced. It's just a malfunction. I told myself. A glitch. A prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. No glitch could explain the cold, creeping fear that was sinking into my bones. No glitch could explain how the whispers felt alive. How they felt as though they knew me, as though they were watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't know what to do. My apartment felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating me with every breath. The light flickered overhead, and I instinctively reached for the switch, but the bulb only hummed in protest, dimming even further. I glanced at the phone again. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to touch it, to risk hearing that voice again. But I knew I had to. I couldn't just leave it there. Maybe there was some way to track it, some way to figure out who had put it there. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and slowly bent down to retrieve it. As soon as my fingers touched the cracked surface, I felt something cold, a jolt of energy that made my skin prickle. The phone seemed to hum under my touch, and I yanked my hand back, heart pounding in my chest. I had never felt anything like that before. I stared at the phone, my breath shallow. Then, as though it were in direct response to my hesitation, the voice spoke again, cutting through the silence like a knife. You can't escape. The words were almost casual, as though they were saying something obvious. But the tone, it was wrong. Like it was laughing at me, playing with me, just waiting for me to lose my grip. The floor beneath me groaned in protest, a low, steady creak. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. No one in the hallway. No movement outside the apartment. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing just behind me, watching my every move. The sound of my own breath, shallow and rapid, was all I could hear now. The hum of the phone was louder, almost deafening in the silence. I felt a pulse of panic surge in me, urging me to throw the phone away, to smash it, to do anything to make it stop. But something stopped me. I couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it. But the longer I held the phone, the more real the voice became. I could feel it in my chest now, as though the voice wasn't coming through the speaker anymore, but directly into my thoughts. I staggered back, holding the phone out in front of me, trying to distance myself from it, but it felt like it was pulling me in, like I was tethered to it. "You're already part of the game." The voice spoke again, this time with a chilling sense of finality. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They weren't mine. They weren't Alex's. They were coming from inside the apartment. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, and my eyes scanned the empty room. I should have felt relief. It was just my imagination, just the fear playing tricks on me, but I didn't. The footsteps were real. I knew that. And they were getting closer. I could hear them, could feel them in my bones. I needed to leave. I needed to run. I backed toward the door, the phone still clutched in my hand, my fingers frozen to it as if I couldn't let go. The door handle was right in front of me now. I could almost taste the freedom, feel the cool night air on my face. But then, the voice came again. "You won't make it out." It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a murmur. It was clear. It was direct. It was a promise. The footsteps stopped, and an unnerving silence descended on the room, heavy and suffocating. I reached for the door handle. My fingers trembled as I gripped it, ready to flee, but something was wrong. It felt like the door was pulling back, like it was fighting me. The more I tried to twist the handle, the more it resisted, like it was stuck in place, frozen. No. I yanked harder, but it wouldn't budge. "You can't leave." The voice was behind me now, so close I could feel its breath on my neck, an icy chill that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the empty room. Just the silence, so loud I could hear my pulse in my ears. The door still wouldn't open. This wasn't real. I thought to myself, this can't be happening. But the voice persisted, unrelenting. "This is your new reality." And then I saw it. The reflection in the hallway mirror. It wasn't mine. It was someone else's. A shadow, tall and indistinct, standing just behind me, its form flickering, shifting with the light. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. No sound. Just the heavy, suffocating silence and the figure behind me, its features indistinguishable, but its presence undeniable. I wasn't alone anymore. My heart raced as the shadow in the mirror twisted, its form becoming clearer by the second. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. The outline was wrong in a way I couldn't even explain. It wasn't just tall. It was too tall. Its limbs were stretched out, impossibly long, and the edges of its figure flickered like the last remnants of a dying television signal. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the coffee table, and I fell hard to the floor. Pain shot through my body, but it was nothing compared to the growing terror inside me. I crawled, desperate to get away from the mirror, from the thing in it. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick with an unshakable sense of impending doom. The voice, that voice, sounded once more, calm and deliberate. "It's time for you to listen." I pressed my back against the wall, staring at the mirror. The shadow moved closer, gliding like liquid across the glass. It had no real shape, just an overwhelming presence that seemed to devour the light. And then, as I watched in horror, it began to speak, without words. I saw it. I saw its mouth open. The edges were jagged, not like any human mouth I had ever seen, but more like cracks in the fabric of reality itself, pulling at the space around it. I didn't hear the voice from the phone anymore, but the same words began to form in my mind, whispered slowly, painfully. "You're already part of it. There's no escape." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, but the words burrowed deeper, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I could feel it, that thing, reaching into my mind, like it was trying to claim it, pull it into its endless void. No, I won't let it happen. I jumped to my feet, adrenaline surging through me, and I rushed to the door once more. My fingers fumbled with the handle, desperate to turn it. It was the only way out. I couldn't let it, whatever it was, trap me here. But again, the door didn't budge. It was like the very wood had grown roots, anchored to the floor, holding me in place. I heard the shadow's slow, deliberate steps behind me. I knew it was getting closer, closer. Every inch of my skin screamed at me to run, to do anything to break free. But I was paralyzed. My body refused to obey, locked in place by some invisible force. The air in the room grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath. It felt like winter, like the walls themselves were made of ice. And then I heard it. The faintest sound, no, a whisper, coming from behind me. It was the voice again, but this time it wasn't clear. It was distorted, like it was being filtered through static, lost in the crackling noise. "You can't run. Not anymore." The shadow in the mirror grew more defined. I could almost make out its features, its face, or what passed for a face. It was as if a part of the room itself had come to life. There was no clear outline, just shifting, dark patterns that danced around the edges of the mirror. I finally twisted the doorknob with all my strength, feeling it give slightly, but still nothing. The door was locked, and this time it felt wrong. Like it wasn't just the lock that was keeping me inside. It was something more. "You've been waiting for this." The voice. It was so close, too close. I whipped around, half expecting to see it right in front of me, but the room was empty. The only thing left was the mirror, and the shadow in it. It was no longer just standing still. The shape was moving, slithering. I reached for my phone, trembling hands clutching it as I brought it up to my ear. There was no dial tone, no sound, just an eerie silence. But then, the whispering voice started again, like a chant that reverberated in my skull. "You can't escape. You can't hide. You're here, and you'll stay." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a loud crash from somewhere deep in the apartment. My heart skipped a beat as my mind screamed at me that I wasn't alone. The door still wouldn't open, and the mirror was now alive, pulsing with dark energy. I could feel it calling to me, pulling me in. I need to get out of here. I need to leave. But the more I struggled, the more I fought, the harder the room pressed in on me. It wasn't just a mirror anymore. The air felt thick, oppressive, alive. Every movement felt like I was being watched. No matter what I did, it was as if the room had been transformed into something else. Something wrong. I dropped to my knees, my breath shallow and frantic. There was no way out. There was nothing left to do. The shadow in the mirror didn't move. It waited. I reached out toward it, my hand trembling, as if I were being drawn to it. The edges of my vision blurred, and I felt a pull, a tugging force that threatened to drag me into the mirror itself. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind the glass, an eye, wide and hollow, staring at me. But before I could process it, the door slammed open, and I stumbled forward into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't stop running. My feet slapped the cold, hard floors of the hallway, my pulse racing, blood pounding in my ears. My mind screamed for me to move faster, get away. But no matter how quickly I ran, it felt like the darkness, the weight of whatever had been in that room, was right behind me, trailing me through the halls. It was everywhere, like an unseen presence, breathing down my neck. I reached the stairs and stumbled down them two at a time. The building was eerily quiet, far too quiet for comfort. There were no neighbors shouting, no sound of TV sets from the apartments, not even the soft hum of a refrigerator. It was like the whole place had been swallowed by a void. I turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs, nearly crashing into a door I hadn't remembered being there. It wasn't part of the usual layout. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond beckoning me with a chilling silence. The whispering started again, faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was all around me. You can't escape. I froze, my body locking up against my will. My stomach churned as a sense of dread sank in deeper, heavy and suffocating. The voice, it wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was in my head. It was in the walls, in the floorboards. I forced myself to move, stepping away from the door. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally long, the shadows warping and shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. The apartment had turned into a maze, and every corner I turned felt like it was closing in on me, tightening its grip, trapping me in an endless loop. Then, a sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was a scratching, slow and deliberate, like nails scraping against wood. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from inside the door. Inside the darkness. I couldn't stop myself. My body, weak from exhaustion, propelled me forward anyway. The door creaked open on its own, the sharp sound of its hinges cutting through the silence. Inside, the room was dim, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. But there was something else. Something wrong. At first, I thought I was seeing things. The room was empty, no one was there. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the far corner of the room. It was hunched over, its back arched unnaturally, and I could hear it, its breath, ragged and strained. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through molasses. I couldn't breathe. The figure turned slowly, its head swiveling too fast, too jerky. Its eyes, those eyes, were hollow, dark pools of nothingness. The mouth opened, wide, stretching impossibly far, like a wound torn open in the fabric of reality. And then it whispered, "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering in my chest. The figure, no, it wasn't human, lunged at me, its movements fast, too fast. I couldn't even react, couldn't move out of the way. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in, suffocating me. I was trapped. But then, a sound, a real sound, sharp and sudden, pierced the air. The figure froze, as if the noise had hit it like a physical blow. I turned my head toward it, confused, but there was no explanation. The sound had come from behind me. The mirror. I hadn't seen it until now, but it was there, on the opposite wall. The one that hadn't been there before when I'd first entered the room. And inside the mirror, I saw it. Not the same thing I had seen before. Not the shadow, but something worse. It was me. The figure in the mirror wasn't just an empty reflection. It was me, but not me. The face in the mirror was twisted, deformed, like something that had been pulled from the deepest nightmares. The eyes stared back at me with a mocking gleam, and the mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't mine. It moved. It moved, as if it knew I was looking at it. And the more I watched, the more alive it became. The figure in the mirror started to reach out, its fingers stretching toward the glass as though it could pass through. My own hands moved without my command, mirroring the actions of the figure. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted. The reflection smiled wider. "It's your turn now," the voice from behind me hissed, echoing in my skull. I felt it. The shadow. The presence. It was behind me again. The real one. And this time, it wasn't just in my mind. It was real. The mirror shattered, the sound of glass breaking was deafening, and I screamed as jagged shards flew toward me. I turned and ran, but the hallway, the room, twisted. It bent. The last thing I saw before everything went black was that figure from the mirror, now standing before me, its face inches from mine. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. It was always real. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.